This is a presentation from Winchester Academy.
Welcome to Winchester Academy's virtual fall series. I am Ann Berger-Linden, and I am the Executive Director of Winchester Academy. Thank you for tuning in. We are grateful to the City of Wapaka, and especially to Josh Werner, for making this space available to us and for providing the technology to make all of this happen. Our next program will be in 1 week when George Kraft returns to give us an update on water issues in our region. That'll be at the same time, 6:30 p.m. on Monday evening. Tonight's program is sponsored by John Guzmer. John and his partner Sue Martin have elected to stay safer at home tonight. Thank you, John. We will have a Q&A session following Kathy's presentation tonight. Questions may be submitted via the Facebook Live site or by telephone. The telephone number is 715-942-9917. We will be doing the Q&A session after the program is completed. That number again, 715-942-9917. Kathy Fehl is Artistic Director of the WEGA Arts Organization. The mission of WAO is to produce original works in theater and film. Kathy's wealth of experience is well suited to that mission, and we're eager to hear her share her program, American Playwrights.
Thank you, Ann. I'm going to start with a slide of vaudeville. And the reason for that is that I'm briefly going to touch on theater in the 19th century in America, which was mostly vaudeville and variety acts or touring companies of Shakespeare and other English playwrights. There were some theaters, for example, the Ford Theater, showing Our American Cousin the Night Lincoln Was Shot. But that play was by an English playwright, Tom Taylor. And I gather that it was an extremely broad comedy. So they had long pauses as the actor waited for laughter and so on. And I'm describing that for a reason, because we're going to go into the contrast between 19th and 20th century theater. In 1829, a 3,000-seat theater was built. Let's see if I've got that slide. Yep, here it is. Called Niblo's Gardens in Lower Manhattan, downtown, Broadway and Prince Street, miles away from what we now know as Times Square in the theater district. And this, too, was the home of comedies, music, not musical theater so much as, although eventually there was some of that, but music and vaudeville and traveling theater troupes up until the late 19th century. Here we have the Lunt-Fontanne Theater, named after a couple who had the place 10 Chimneys down in Lake Geneva. And they spent a lot of time in New York because they were very successful actors, and the theater was named after them. Here are a couple more. So this started after 1939, when the Metropolitan Opera moved to the Times Square area. Everything in New York, I sort of take this for granted because I lived there for so long, but New York started downtown in what is now the Wall Street area, and then worked its way gradually up through what we call Soho now, up into what we call the Village, and so on, so that most of what we think of as Manhattan now wasn't even developed until well into the 19th century, and so on. So here we have a few big Broadway houses. And these are just some of the many theaters in Times Square. And in New York, you have 3 designations of theater that are actually terms used by Actors' Equity to determine pay scales and other regulations. Off Broadway, which is under 100 seats, so up to 90 through 99. From 100 to 499 is considered off Broadway, and 500 up is, and that's usually under 1,000. Broadway houses are not huge. Is Broadway. So a Broadway theater technically could be somewhere else, and sometimes is in the city. Generally the Broadway houses are in Times Square. around it on 46th, 47th, and so on. So the 20th century saw the rise of strong American playwrights. There was still vaudeville, and there were still troupes who did adaptations of theater. We had the Yiddish theater on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, which was one of the nurturers of the development of New York City theater. But the shift toward dramas and the playwrights we're going to focus on was accompanied by a shift away from the presentational gestural theater toward the realism and the suspension of disbelief that we think of usually as the hallmark of a good production. The concept of four-walling was born with that kind of play. You know what that is? That's the actors don't interact with the audience. They're in a world of their own. And occasionally, some play will call for breaking the fourth wall, meaning somebody will go downstage and give a monologue to the audience, and it's quite exciting, but that's very unusual. Generally, a play works well because you've got two separate worlds, and the people connect by identifying with the actors, not by interacting with them. So it's a different kind of world than we had in the 19th century. And it started, the first playwright who worked that way that's substantial and important is Eugene O'Neill, born in 1888, whose plays were very focused on inner conflict and self-deception and very, I don't know if realistic is quite naturalistic. I mean, they were people with problems and, things like that, family dynamics. And around that same time, beginning of the 20th century, Stanislavski, who was the director of the Moscow Theater, saw the actress Eleonora Duse perform. She had emerged from a traveling theater troupe in Italy as a major star, and she's a real paradigm shift personality because she was very understated, very subtle, and very natural. And unlike, let's say, Sarah Bernhardt, who was a star, but still an example of the I'm really sad, kind of school of theater. She did it well, but Eleonora Duse was the opposite. And Stanislavski was entranced by this and began developing a new technique for acting and directing, which eventually in this country came to be known as method acting, because as you'll see, it was adapted here. He did this in Moscow. And here in America, the group theater was started in order to work with actors in this new way, to develop techniques and methods of helping actors to create emotions, to connect with their own emotions, to learn to use their instrument, as they call the whole body is your acting instrument, the way a musician would have a trumpet. Your body is your instrument in the theater. So there's a huge whole new development of ways of working on acting. And the group theater soon became morphed into the actor studio, which we all know, I'm sure, as the sort of the zenith of acting, and the place where huge numbers of important actors have studied and worked on stuff, and they thank you. I knew. See, I can't do two things at once. Sometimes I can. Thank you, Ian. That's the actor studio. The group theater. You have those slides then? That's Lee Strasberg, Harold Klurman, and Cheryl Crawford, who started the group theater. You'll see that throughout this presentation, various of the playwrights that I talk about interact with the studio. They interact with the various places that nurture playwrights and nurture new work. So I'm going to focus a lot on the journey of each playwright to Broadway. How do they get there? Because that also represents what it is like to create new material in America. And there are different pathways. There are theater companies. There are people who find an agent and get a producer. There are people who start somewhere out of town in a small town, let's say Wauwiga, and they do work on developing their play, and then work on building enough press and audience so that it can move to a bigger city and so forth. So there are various routes. So, Eugene O'Neill. O'Neill was born into a theater. That's at the studio. That's Paul Newman at the studio. And I think that's James Dean at the studio. And that's Lee Strasberg with Marilyn Monroe getting a soda while they're working on stuff at the studio. So you see that this was a real center of artistic activity. What's the next slide? Oh, I think that's the Eugene O'Neill Foundation. We'll be talking about a place that was named after Eugene O'Neill, started in the 60s, which is dedicated to developing new works. Both theater, slow down. That's the public. They've just done a lot with a lot of playwrights, some of whom you'll hear about here. And they do plays and musicals. They get lots of submissions at this point every year, but people can go there. It's in Connecticut, in the country. They just focus in on the new play. So next, that's the public theater, started by Joe Papp, who first started the Delacroix in Central Park, where he does free Shakespeare every summer, or did. It's still there. He's gone. But this place is another one that's supremely important. And some things you've heard of are Chorus Line, and some of the plays that you'll hear about in here. Just all sorts of stuff going on all the time. Next is Ellen Stewart, I think. No, that's Joe in his office. Go on. That's Ellen Stewart. She's another seminal character in New York theater in the 20th century. She fostered new playwrights, and many playwrights would never have made it without her. And her theater is still there on East 4th Street. And that's a rehearsal or a backers audition. Backers audition is when a playwright gets a bunch of actors together and has a producer and invites investors to come and see an early read-through. If it has music, there'll be a piano. And these are the traditional dusty rooms in the Broadway area that you rent to do a backers audition. Sometimes if you get closer to the reality of raising the huge amount of money you need, you go to a theater and do a final backers audition. So that could be either one. That's looking out from the stage into a Broadway house. They're huge, the whole array of lights and their cables and staircases backstage. Very exciting. That is Streetcar with Marlon Brando, Just Candy. That's the original Broadway show. That's Death of a Salesman. And next one that is True West by Sam Shepard with Malkovich and Gary Sinise. Okay. I think we're ready for Gene, yeah. Eugene O'Neill. His family was difficult. Mother was a morphine addict, father was an alcoholic. And he wrote while doing various jobs, including at sea. And then he had play readings at coffee shops in Greenwich Village. And from there, he went to Provincetown in 1916, where the Provincetown Players had converted an old fishing shack into a theater. The group from Provincetown then went to New York and started the Provincetown Players on McDougal Street, which is downtown in the Village, and then went to Broadway with The Emperor Jones, which is a long one-act, O'Neill's first hit, and it was a big hit, an expressionistic fable about a man who sets himself up as the emperor of a Caribbean island. Part adventure, part metaphor. O'Neill's career continued with Anna Christie, Moon for the Misbegotten, Strange Interlude, which was an extraordinary experiment. The characters spoke not just subtext. By subtext, we mean I have a line saying, I really would like to go see that movie, and then I yawn, and you infer that I really don't want to go see the movie. I'm really tired. But he went further than that and the actors actually spoke 2 sets of lines. And the play was, I think it was 6 hours long or something like that. And in fact, when they revived it, they did it over 2 days. So you bought your ticket for 2 consecutive nights. I don't know how they did it the first time. I think people just went and sat there with a break for dinner or something. But they actually would speak their lines and then say the line about what they were thinking and not saying, and even going a little further to what they didn't know they were thinking, possibly from time to time. So the unconscious. So that was apparently very interesting to see and worked, but very, very odd. That was in 1928. It was survived in 1963. The Iceman Cometh, a story that takes place in a bar, is in fact an epic depiction of human beings' struggle with obligation and guilt and much more. It's very complex, given the fact that it all takes place in this one room. But the references and the interactions and the preoccupations with politics and with the lives that the people wanted but didn't have, the lives that all sorts of things. The most recent Broadway revival was in 2019 and starred Denzel Washington and David Morse and many others. It's quite an ensemble. And then one of his best known is Long Day's Journey into Night, very autobiographical. And that was made into a film. So I think Anna Christie was with Greta Garbo. Moon for the Misbegotten, I'm not sure. Anyway, O'Neill's daughter went for somebody with more humor. Married Charlie Chaplin against O'Neill's wishes, and he never saw her again. O'Neill's dramatic life did not even resolve with his death. His wife, Carlotta, was given to mysticism and continued to speak to Eugene, often in the presence of others, for the rest of her life. People describe the readings and productions of O'Neill's plays in Provincetown as the birth of modern American theater. Perhaps this is because not only was the swing toward realism and the fourth wall emphasized, but the psychological dynamics within a family, the de facto power of each parent, for example, or each civic leader, were observed. And then we move on to Clifford Odettes. His name hasn't remained a household word, but he was a big deal at the time. He was born in 1906 in Philadelphia to Russian Jewish immigrants. The family moved to the Bronx. Odettes developed a love of theater and dropped out of school to pursue acting. He was able to get a job when he dropped out of high school in a Broadway producer's office. One of his plays was produced in a small theater and flopped. He then worked for 4 summers at the dramatic camps in the Catskills and Poconos. Those were very popular at the time. People went up there for entertainment. The whole family would go, but the youth would participate in acting workshops or whatever. But there was a lot of acting. Eventually, he was brought into the group theater just as it was founding, a place where the focus was on the theater as art and on the shift toward naturalism and social relevance. As I had already said, Lee Strasberg, Harold Clurman, and Cheryl Crawford formed that in New York City. Became the studio. Today, Ellen Burstyn and Al Pacino are the leaders at the studio. For some years, Odettes continued acting, working with Lee Strasberg and fine-tuning his sense of dialogue and of the dynamics between characters. In the group theater, we find that very American focus on ordinary families confronting hardships or tough moral situations that was and is a big part of most dramatists' work, even in writers who lean toward the comedic, like Neil Simon. Odettes gradually turned his focus to writing and developed Awake and Sing, which apparently Lee did not like, so that didn't progress. And then he wrote Waiting for Lefty, which was his first play to get produced and then moved to Broadway. So in other words, it was produced at the studio and then went to Broadway from there, or the group as it still was. Waiting for Lefty is about cabbies striking for better pay. Odettes brings the needs of one of the cabbies' family and the awareness of the very real risks involved in joining the strike front and center. Though engaging and dramatic, the play is without question one with a very clear point of view and has even been called agitprop. The mingling of entertainment with purpose is very, very clear in most of Odettes' work, although that's the one that's the most like that, I think. The line between being meaningful and being didactic is sometimes pretty thin. Waiting for Lefty was a huge success, bringing audiences to its feet with its call to action. Awake and Sing went to Broadway, a play about a Jewish family struggling with economic collapse during the Depression. And then Golden Boy, about the conflict an artist faces between the lure of money and the commitment to his work. In 1938, the group presented Rocket to the Moon, a psychological play that explores the failure of human beings to fulfill their creative potential. The focus on the inner conflicts rather than on man in the grip of circumstances brought a lot of criticism. He was abandoning his tough role as an observer of social corruption. The playwright George S. Kaufman famously asked, "Odettes, where is thy sting?" Though it didn't do well at the box office, it put Odettes on the cover of Time in December 1938. That's Rocket to the Moon. So from there, now he's a big shot, he went to Hollywood, where he was very successful. One of his films was The Country Girl with Grace Kelly and Bing Crosby, and Kelly won an Oscar for her role. Odettes returned to Broadway, and in 1954, his play The Flowering Peach was up for a Pulitzer, but lost to Tennessee Williams' Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Odettes died in L.A. in 1963 with stomach cancer. He's remembered as one of the most important 20th century playwrights. His plays were anticipated with great excitement. Here's what Patty Chayefsky, a competitor, had to say. "There isn't a writer of my generation, especially a New York writer, who doesn't owe his very breath, his entire attitude toward theater, to Odettes." So, he must have been a big deal. Moss Hart. Born in New York City in 1904, he fell in love with the theater early. After a foray into Broadway back offices as a gopher, person who does odds and ends and gets coffee, Hart had his first play produced at age 18, but it flopped. Hart got a job in the garment district and worked on scripts at night. They were rejected. He then got a job in the Borscht Belt, again, in the Catskills, entertaining the guests, leading workshops, and honed his comedy skits there for several seasons. And then he brought a script to George Kaufman, who was already very successful, to help him with his script Once Upon a Time. It got out-of-town tryouts and then opened on Broadway in 1930, catapulting him from Nowheresville to stardom overnight. Kaufman and Hart worked together on 7 more plays. You Can't Take It With You in 1936, The Man Who Came to Dinner in 1939, and Hart also wrote Lady in the Dark, which was a musical, which he also directed, and he wrote books for musicals by Irving Berlin and Cole Porter. Moss Hart wrote the extremely engaging autobiography Act One, which I highly recommend. It's really fun, and it gives you a real sense of, if you haven't read it, of the life of the theater in New York, as it was and even as it is. Besides describing his own journey with all the hard work and seemingly ceaseless disappointments, finally stopped short by astonishing, resounding success, the book paints a great and informative picture. Moss Hart was married to Kitty Carlisle, and he died in 1961 at the age of 57 of a heart attack in Palm Springs. Next one is Horton Foote. He was really probably more prominent in film, and again, his name isn't widely known, but he was an important playwright, born in Horton, Texas in 1916, and he started out pursuing acting in California. He also tried his hand at writing and did better with that, and became successful at writing screenplays such as To Kill a Mockingbird and Tender Mercies among them. And he also wrote for the stage. His group of 9 plays entitled The Orphan's Home Cycle includes among its 3 most important, the play 1918. I did a reading of this play, and it was the first time I remember hearing about the influenza pandemic. We saw it all through the eyes of a family in a small town. I wonder how much more shocked and disconcerted I would have been by COVID-19 had I not encountered this play. The road to Broadway for Horton Foote was by way of television and film. His career in all 3 was successful. A Trip to Bountiful, having started life on TV, then gone to Broadway, ended up as a film and brought an Academy Award nomination for him and a Best Actress Award for Geraldine Page. Horton Foote died in 2009. Tennessee Williams. Growing up in Mississippi and then Missouri, Williams had a tough dad who pulled him out of the University of Missouri when he was studying journalism there, and Williams then got a job in a shoe factory, famously alluded to in A Glass Menagerie. The character of Tom is based to some degree on the character of Tennessee. His sister had disabilities, just as Laura does in the play, and so forth. After a breakdown and lots of writing, his own breakdown, he went to the University of Iowa, where he met other writers. He then moved to New Orleans and continued to write, and his start came when he submitted a play to the group theater and won a prize of $100. And he was also there discovered by Audrey Woods, who became his agent and promoter. This tiny, forceful woman was his friend for many years until a quarrel separated them. Tennessee, whom I met in New York at his residence at the LSA Hotel, asked me to see her, and I did. And she was very eager to hear every detail. I don't know that they ever reconciled, however. Anyway, I digress. It was a thrill meeting Audrey Woods. She had one of those dark offices in the theater district and had been there for decades. Anyway, she helped arrange backers' auditions, and Tennessee's first play, Battle of Angels, later rewritten as Orpheus Descending, opened in Boston, where it also closed. Eventually, in 1944, A Glass Menagerie made it to Broadway after premiering in Chicago. So there you have that on-the-road, out-of-town thing. Chicago has a lot of theater, and so doing a play there and developing it is not all that unusual. Boston was famous for it, but Chicago too. Two supportive critics in Chicago helped build an audience, building enough confidence in investors to move the show to Broadway, and a star was born. The production featured Laurette Taylor as Amanda, and her performance is still mythical. She got tremendous reviews for that show, so that helped too. In the case of Tennessee Williams, we see the pathway via a theater company or organization, the group, to the classic backers audition, out-of-town tryouts, and then Broadway. After the success of Menagerie in Chicago in 1944 and then Broadway in 45, came Streetcar Named Desire in 47, and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof in 55, Sweet Bird of Youth in 59, Night of the Iguana in 61. Williams also wrote fiction in many more plays, one-acts and features, and full-length plays. As often happens, when Williams tried new things, they were not well received. The Ricky Nelson at the Garden syndrome. Objective responses are difficult to come by once a commodity has become established. Williams had a life filled with glamorous movie stars, from Anna Magnani to Richard Burton, as his plays were made into films. Williams' last years often included the frustration of his new experiments with writing being rejected. He continued, nevertheless. He split his time between Key West and New York City. He is remembered as a lyrical writer with the ability to infuse his characters with a voice that leaves the audience recognizing their humanness and their longings. His major plays are still performed around the world, and his films are still beloved. He died at the LSA, choking on the cap of a pill bottle. It's sort of, what is the right word? Ignominious death for such a great man. But that's how it goes. Thornton Wilder. Our Town, The Matchmaker, and The Skin of Our Teeth are among the plays of Thornton Wilder. He is also the author of the extraordinary novel, The Bridge of San Luis Rey. He was born in Madison, Wisconsin in 1897. Early grades were spent at the Thatcher School, a boarding school in Ojai, California, where he was tormented for being overly intellectual and no doubt serious. His father went from being a journalist to being a diplomat, and Wilder and his siblings spent part of their childhood in China. His brother Amos went to Harvard Divinity School and developed something called theopoetics, Isabel Wilder also became a writer. Thornton graduated from Berkeley High, then served in the Army during World War I, and then went to Oberlin, then Yale, and then got a master's degree in French literature from Princeton. And in between, he studied at the American Academy in Rome, studying archaeology and Italian. He taught French in New Jersey and then at the University of Chicago and became quite well known as a professor. In 1938, he won a Pulitzer for Our Town, and he won again in 1943 for The Skin of Our Teeth. He served in the Army Air Force Intelligence during World War II until 1945. He considered himself a teacher first and a writer second. Alfred Hitchcock asked him to write the screenplay for Shadow of a Doubt, which he did, and Wilder's career continued as a playwright and novelist. In 1944, The Matchmaker, which he developed from his earlier flop, The Merchant of Yonkers, ran successfully on Broadway, and in 1968, Hello, Dolly was made from that. The original story comes from Nestroy, an Austrian playwright. So that's another thing that happens in the theater. You have a play, and it gets turned into a variation of itself. It's not infrequent. Wilder is the most conspicuously educated playwright I've learned about. Certainly he was exceptionally capable, translating into several languages and using his diverse interests and skills. He was friends with Hemingway, Stein, and other luminaries of his time, and always remained close to his siblings and their families. Lorraine Hansberry. Lorraine Hansberry was born in Chicago in 1930. Her father was fairly well-to-do. He was a realtor, and he bought a home on the South Side for his family, and a part of the South Side that was white. And the community was appalled and tried to get rid of them. Carl Hansberry took the case all the way to the Supreme Court, where in 1940, the decision came down that it wasn't illegal for the family to live there, but neither was it illegal to try to get them to move. It took until 1948 for the Jim Crow covenant that enabled the racism they endured to be decreed unconstitutional with the Shelley versus Kramer decision. Her parents were both active with the NAACP and the Republican Party. As a result of Lorraine's father's activism, Paul Robeson and Langston Hughes, Jesse Owens, W.B. Du Bois, and Duke Ellington were among the frequent visitors to their home. Lorraine went to the University of Wisconsin in Madison. She immediately became very involved with communist politics and then went to Guadalajara to study painting at the university there. In 1950, she left Madison and went to New York City to write. There, she worked with Robeson and Du Bois on a newspaper involved with the pursuit of rights for Black people. Lorraine associated the struggle for equal rights with class system issues, not perhaps unreasonably. Her play, A Raisin in the Sun, named after a line from a Langston Hughes poem, was a huge success. The producer, Philip Rose, had a great deal of trouble finding investors. He was from a Russian Jewish family on the Lower East Side and also very involved with civil rights. Later, he produced Shenandoah and other things on Broadway. Anyway, the play describes racism, but it is rooted in the conflicts within a Black family. To some extent, the story draws on Hansberry's life story with many additions. It includes a Black neighbor who is horrified when the central family decide to move to a white neighborhood, sure they will be blown up and killed. This character, Mrs. Johnson, embodies the Uncle Toms, those who are afraid to stand up for their rights, deterred by the risks involved. I include this detail because it demonstrates Lorraine's courage. I think it's courageous of her to have dealt with factions within the Black community. Another character in love with Benitha, the main protagonist, tells her that straightening her hair is like mutilation. The exploration of the urgent need to fight for rights in conjunction with the need to maintain the Black identity is, of course, very interesting. It was thought that the 95% white audiences who so loved the play still, in all probability, went home to exercise the right to keep their own neighborhoods white. These conflicts, those within the Black and the white communities, are still with us. We view tribalism as an anachronism, and we also detest those who are cavalier about their roots. Whether immigrants or ethnic or racist minorities, I think this tug of war is extremely topical and part of the discussion of America's history and culture vis-a-vis race. Other works by Hansberry are The Sign in Sidney Brustein's Window, Les Blancs, The Drinking Gourd, What Use Are Flowers, and To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. During the last few years of her short life, Hansberry made lesbianism a public part of her life and became thus an activist against homophobia. She died at the age of 34 of pancreatic cancer. Raising the Sun has been made into a musical, serialized on TV, and in 2014 was revived on Broadway, not for the first time, this time in a production starring Denzel Washington. In 1969, Nina Simone first released a song about Hansberry called To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. The title of the song refers to the title of Hansberry's autobiography, which Hansberry first coined when speaking to the winners of a creative writing conference on May 1st, 1964. Lorraine was Nina Simone's daughter Lisa's godmother. And now for another fierce woman, Lillian Hellman. Born in New Orleans in 1905 to a Jewish family, her father was a liquor dealer. Lillian spent half the year in New Orleans and half in New York City during most of her childhood. She studied at Columbia and NYU, married a playwright, Arthur Kober, in 1925, but often traveled alone. For example, she went to Bonn in Germany to continue her studies, where the story goes that while she was there, she was briefly attracted by a Nazi group because of some of the dogma that they preached, but almost immediately realized that they were extremely anti-Semitic. She says that for the first time in her life, she thought about being a Jew. She went back to the States. While working for Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer in Hollywood, writing summaries of books for potential screenplays, she met Dashiell Hammett, the famous noir writer. She divorced Kober. Hammett and Hellman were together on and off till he died in 1961. Hellman became a prime mover and shaker of Screen Actors Guild, which deals with the rights of writers and actors. Well, particularly actors. I don't think there was a Writers Guild yet. I'm not sure. It is quite interesting to imagine how writers with whom she was an activist against Franco and even against Trotsky thought about the politics at the time. They felt that Stalin should be an ally against fascism, for example. Martha Gellhorn, the journalist who was in Spain with Hemingway, spoke of a write-up of a trip to Spain that Hellman made while they were there as a fiction, kind way of putting it. Langston Hughes, on the other hand, admired the work of going and supporting the anti-fascists. It was very, it's the semantics are interesting, and we should try to unravel them, because who was supporting what might not seem as strange as it does superficially if we look at really, sort of deconstruct the words involved. She was involved in politics and was called before the House Un-American Activities Committee. I think that comes a little later. Sorry. After dropping out of NYU and further adventures in L.A., Lillian Hellman got a job working for a theatrical producer, Herman Shumlin. She read scripts that people submitted. She asked Shumlin to read the 6th draft of her first play, The Children's Hour. He produced it on Broadway, where it opened in 1934. Dashiell Hammett had suggested the subject to her. The subject was from a book based on a real event in Edinburgh in 1810. Hellman became one of the most successful playwrights of the next 3 decades. Things weren't always easy, though, and controversy surrounded much of her life. Her play, Days to Come, opened on Broadway in 1936 and closed after 7 days. It concerned labor management relations in a small town. The communists denounced it because the author did not take a side. Others renounced it as a defense of Stalinism. I don't even know what the context is there, but it must have been interesting. The Little Foxes opened on Broadway in 1939, starring Tallulah Bankhead. Watch on the Rhine, about World War II, opened in 1941. She wrote 2 more plays about the war. She and Hemingway hosted an event to raise money for prisoners of the Nazis held in France, because they were part of the Resistance. After lots of successful work in Hollywood, she learned that she could no longer be hired because she'd been blacklisted. Everyone who refused to answer questions regarding their political affiliation was. In 1952, Hellman was called to I think she was blacklisted even prior to having been called. Hellman was called to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. where she refused to name names. The resulting notoriety colored the rest of her life and her legacy. Years later, she wrote a couple of autobiographical books and enraged Mary McCarthy, who called her a liar and plagiarist and lobbied further choice insults at her. They had been friends, and lawsuits went back and forth. She remained a controversial personality until her death on Martha's Vineyard at the age of 79. Arthur Miller. Here's a quote from him. "The quality in such plays, i.e. tragedies, that does shake us derives from the underlying fear of being displaced. The disaster inherent in being torn away from our chosen image of what and who we are in this world. Among us today, this fear is as strong and perhaps stronger than it ever was. In fact, it is the common man who knows this fear best." By which I think he means the person who's not extraordinarily wealthy or famous, but is living their life. This quote from Miller illuminates his style. From All My Sons on, his pieces describe people in fraught situations, struggling to be strong. Death of a Salesman, usually thought of not just as his best, but one of the best of the century, sticks to the confines of a life and occupation. Of course, there are resonances that seem obvious, but the restraint, the parameters, serve the play well. Miller was born in 1915 in New York City, and the Depression shaped his family's life. He began writing while working in a warehouse job. His first success was with the short and excellent novel Focus, about a man in Brooklyn who, after getting glasses, is perceived as being Jewish, which he was not. It's very good. I recommend it. His first play, No Villain, was written while he was at the University of Michigan. It brought in some badly needed prize money. It got a premiere in 2015. His next play, The Man Who Had All the Luck, was written in 1944 and produced on Broadway that same year, where it ran for 4 performances. Miller was determined to give up writing for the theater if his next play, All My Sons, didn't succeed. In 1946, Miller wrote All My Sons, and it was produced on Broadway in 1947 by Harold Clurman of the Group Theater and directed by Elia Kazan. It was based on a true story about an aeronautical firm in Ohio. Miller was called to testify in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee as a result of this perception of the play as critical of the American dream. Miller and Kazan famously parted ways when Kazan named names in the hearings. This was so morally abhorrent to Miller that even much later in his autobiographical book, Time Bends, Miller addresses it, not glibly, but still with great feeling. Miller refused to name people, was convicted of a contempt, appealed, and won. Death of a Salesman went up in 1949, directed by Kazan, so still before the HUAC situation, and won a Pulitzer and a Tony. It's been revived 4 times on Broadway. The role of Willie Loman was originated by Lee J. Cobb. The other 3 who played it were George T. Scott, Dustin Hoffman, and Brian Dennehy. Another famous work, the Dustin Hoffman one was an eccentric choice from a casting point of view because the blustering big guys were the quintessential salesmen that were in the other productions. And I saw the Hoffman one. It was very, very difficult to take in because of that image, of the salesman and Death of a Salesman. But it worked well. It was fine. Another famous work was the screenplay and movie The Misfits, starring Miller's then-wife Marilyn Monroe and Clark Gable. Great movie. Miller continued writing and having his plays produced until he died in 2005 at his home in Connecticut. And now we come to Edward Albee. He's another one who was innovative, I would say, to some degree. Certainly a very incisive writer. His 3 one-acts, The Zoo Story in 1959, The Sandbox in 1959, and The American Dream in 1961 were Albee's first successes. Rejected by New York producers, the play premiered in West Berlin at the Schiller Theater Werkstatt on September 28, 1959, in a double bill with the German premiere of Samuel Beckett's Krapp's Last Tape. The play premiered in the United States off-Broadway in a production by at the Provincetown Playhouse in 1960. Again, with Krapp's Last Tape. The cast included William Daniels and George Maharis. And this went on, it got rave reviews and won the 1960 Albee Award for Distinguished Play. That's off-Broadway. And William Daniels got an award too, and so forth. Born Edward Harvey in 1928, Edward Albee was given up for adoption by his mother when he was 2 weeks old. His father had gone away. And the Albee family, which adopted him, were part owners of a chain of vaudeville theaters and ran a business showing saddle horses. The Albees lived in Larchmont, New York. Reed Albee, the father, inherited millions from the vaudeville chain, which his father had started, and young Edward was driven to see theater productions in Manhattan. His childhood appears to have been difficult. He read books he found in the home only to be scolded. The books were just for show. Albee wrote a farce when he was 12. He was kicked out of private schools, including Choate, but went on to college at Trinity Harvard and dropped out. He'd had a fight with Reed and Francis Albee over late-night drinking and didn't speak to them for 20 years. So he was on his own. I have no idea if they supported him or not, in spite of not being on speaking terms. I would guess probably not, but I don't know. His second play was The Zoo Story in 1958, and Albee moved to Greenwich Village in Manhattan. Okay, so I've already said that. The play received mostly positive reviews, though the absurd aspects created some confusion and fueled some naysayers. Waiting for Godot, which could be considered absurd theater, had premiered on Broadway previously in 1956, but Beckett and Ionesco and people like that were still not anything we were used to, and even today are not really quite used to that as part of the theater landscape. So in other words, it's the use of rhythm and non sequiturs, much less linear than what we generally anticipate. The criteria for winning a Pulitzer in drama included what was known, this is a big deal, that's a betrayal, it's considered. In drama, included what was known as the uplift clause. This is what the criteria read in 1958. And this comes about in relationship to the play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf. For the American play, preferably original in its source, is what Pulitzers are for, and dealing with American life, which shall represent in marked fashion the educational value and power of the stage. This was changed after the non-decision Ray Virginia Woolf. What happened was that he was nominated for a Pulitzer after the play Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was on Broadway. And it was voted to win. But then the advisory board came in and said, no, it's just too dark, it's too cuts too deep, it's too harsh, it's too cruel. It's not uplifting. So then they changed because there was tremendous outrage because of this, the criteria now read, for a distinguished play by an American author, preferably original in its source and dealing with American life. The difference seems subtle to me, but the qualifiers were used to support the rejection of the play. I think the story of Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is pivotal to the story of the 20th century. After the Industrial Revolution, a wide stretch of people began to have time to exercise their curiosity about themselves and the texture of society. Perhaps this goes hand in hand with the development of psychoanalysis. What is now included in the world of entertainment, the shift first toward realism and then more and more pieces that ponder inner life, is meaningful. A lot of playwrights are critical of society and all are keen observers. This has always been true. But the focus on the self and on the darker sides that we might not express comfortably in our relationships, but that a playwright observes and wants to examine, this is all, a change on a certain kind of continuum, I think, and moved American theater increasingly from the depiction of events toward a breakdown or examination of the way we each evaluate our own attitudes and actions, a kind of deconstruction, I suppose. Some see Beckett in his way and Albee as bleak, as writers who ignore joy. Others find that they reveal the best and most tender things about human beings, the sort of authentic and vulnerable human being. Edward Albee went on to win 3 Pulitzers, A Delicate Balance, Seascape in 66, Seascape in 75, and 3 Tall Women in 1994. I think Glenda Jackson was in that on Broadway. Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf was made into a movie with Richard Burton and Elizabeth Taylor. While many were shocked by the bitterness and animus of the piece, Taylor astounded critics as she demonstrated that she was an extraordinary actress without any assistance from good looks, glamour, or technicolor. A tour de force and a turning point was directed by Mike Nichols. Productive till the end with plays and essays, Albee died in Montauk, Long Island in 2016. August Wilson. Ian? Thank you. August Wilson was born in 1945 in Pittsburgh, PA. His situation was made more complicated than it might otherwise have been because his father was white and his mother and stepfather black. The family moved to the mostly white suburb of Hazelwood, where they met with racial threats, and Wilson quit school at age 15 after having been accused of plagiarizing a paper. He continued his education by reading at the public library. In 1968, he co-founded the Black Horizons Theater in Pittsburgh. He published poetry in Black World in 1971 and Black Lines in 1972. In 1976, Wilson moved to St. Paul, Minnesota, where he developed Jitney, part of the 10-part Pittsburgh cycle. It was produced in St. Paul at the Penumbra Theater and in Pittsburgh at the Allegheny Rep. In 1982, August Wilson submitted Ma Rainey's Black Bottom to the O'Neill National Playwrights Conference, which we've talked about before. I showed the picture of it, a place that many of these people ran through at some point or other. This is a place in Waterford, Connecticut, that takes plays from unknown playwrights, selects some, and develops them in workshops. Jean Passananti writes that Lloyd Richards, she was working at the O'Neill, the director of the O'Neill at the time, was not an initial supporter. The play was nonlinear, very unfinished too. However, the majority of the readers voted it in, and the rest is history. The play had, prior to that, been rejected at the O'Neill for 5 years in a row. Here's a quote, Ray letting him know. All the playwrights got a telegram telling them they'd been selected and to report to the pre-conference weekend. And then I would call them and say, fly in, we'll pick you up at the airport, you can give us your receipt and we'll reimburse you. My first call with August, he said, I can't afford to buy a ticket. So I had to figure out a way to get him a ticket. During the first workshop, August was very quiet and smoked a lot. It looked like it was going to be an 8-hour play. But as August read the play aloud, as protocol required, people were rapt, deeply attentive, and decided the work was brilliant. Wilson had previously founded his own theater, Black Horizons, in Pittsburgh. Getting to workshop a piece at the O'Neill, however, was something he was very gratified by, and he was very willing, very eager to learn from others as he improved his craft. From the O'Neill, Lloyd Richards took the play to Yale Rep. By now, I guess he had become a fan, where he was head of the drama department. The play opened on Broadway in October 1984, just 2 years after that. Wilson's depictions of family life in black communities became a part of the efforts of Americans to grasp the differences in the black and white communities. Fences, one of his best-known works, another part of the Pittsburgh cycle, received a Tony and a Pulitzer in 1987. Wilson died of cancer in 2005. Denzel Washington produced, directed, and starred in a movie version of Fences in 2016. The film received 4 Oscar nominations, and Viola Davis won for Best Supporting Actress. Lanford Wilson. Lanford Wilson was born in Missouri in 1937 and raised there in several small towns. He fell for the theater when he saw a production of Brigadoon at Missouri State University. He moved to Greenwich Village in 1962, and some of his early works were read at Cafe Chino, named after Joe Chino, who became his mentor. And this place is known as having been the first off-Broadway theater. The play, The Madness of Lady Bright, premiered at Chino and ran for 200 shows. From there, Lanford wrote plays that were with the support of Ellen Stewart at La Mama on 4th Street, which, though it contained small houses, under 100, had tremendous status. The place had housed so many important works. And she also did have access to larger theaters at times that she also used. I'm not sure what happened there, but being at La Mama is prestigious. So the fact that it was a small house wasn't so important. Lanford Wilson was one of the playwrights, along with Sam Shepard, Albee, and John Guare, who participated in the O'Neill Foundation's first year of existence. In '69, Lanford formed Circle Rep with Marshall Mason, who had directed many of his plays by then, and began developing his plays and built the careers of many actors, including Jeff Daniels, many more too, but Jeff is somebody who's around right now. 5th of July, his first Broadway play, Hot L Baltimore, an ensemble piece off-Broadway, hit at Circle. Tally's Folly, starring Judd Hirsch and Trish Hawkins, won Tonys for the author and the stars. Burn This, originally starring John Malkovich and Joan Allen on Broadway in '87, was recently revived, starring Adam Driver and Kerry Russell. Lanford Wilson is a great, and I think the first example of having plays move from off to off and then to Broadway. He's also an example of the role of the artistic director of a company functioning as a permanent writer in residence. Circle Rep also nurtured many other writers and brought in shows to develop from Steppenwolf in Chicago and premiered Sam Shepard's Fool for Love, brought in from the Magic Theater in San Francisco. Wilson died in 2011. David Mamet, born in Chicago in 1947, known for the rhythm and the profanity of his dialogue. He began writing plays while at Goddard College. Returning to Chicago, he worked in factories and at other jobs, a useful immersion in diverse circumstances. In 1973, he started the St. Nicholas Theater Company in Chicago. Many of his plays are characterized by various game strategies as both structure and as a part of the emphasis on the transactional aspects of relationships. In 1976, 3 one-acts were presented off-Broadway: The Duck Variations, Sexual Perversity in Chicago, and American Buffalo. I think American Buffalo is probably the most famous of those and performed by actors around the country. Glengarry Glen Ross ran on Broadway, directed by Gregory Mosher, and though it shocked many, it was very enjoyable and won a Pulitzer. It could be regarded as partly an homage to Miller's Death of a Salesman, as the life of a man aging out of his job, this time in real estate, is presented as both ludicrous and poignant. It has crossed my mind that it's interesting that 3 major American plays, The Iceman Cometh, Death of a Salesman, and Glengarry Glen Ross, have at their center the painful aspects of these masked presentational lives. Because those are really 3 great plays. I saw Glengarry Glen Ross on Broadway. It was incredible. Very, very fast-paced and much better than anything else I've ever seen of his. Very, very good. I think it was a lot of that was the production and the actors. Gregory Mosher worked with him a lot and directed it really well. But it is remarkable. Other plays, including Race, The Anarchist, The Penitent, and Oleana, have had varying degrees of success. Mamet has also written screenplays, among them The Verdict, Hoffa, Wag the Dog, and Ronan. He's directed films of his own, Homicide, Speed the Plow, and House of Games. In 1985, Mamet and W.H. Macy, part of his regular acting team, started the Atlantic Theater Company in New York City. Mamet lives in Santa Monica with his second wife, Rebecca Pidgeon. Wendy Wasserstein was extremely important in New York and has really seems to have been completely forgotten. She was a prominent playwright in the 80s, 70s and 80s. The life of Wendy Wasserstein formed her plays pretty directly. The Heidi Chronicles, Wendy and the Lost Boys. Born into a well-to-do family in Brooklyn, Wasserstein had to deal with a demanding mother for whom nothing she did or was good enough, but who also placed her daughter on a pedestal. This mixed message influenced the girl greatly. She consciously worked at her writing in order to manage the sense of being misunderstood and abandoned. Uncommon Women and Others was produced at the Yale Drama Department while Wendy was in school there, and during a time when the Yale Drama Department looked really good on a resume. Wasserstein accompanied her friend Christopher Durang, a comic playwright with whom she had co-written some things, to the O'Neill Foundation, where readings and workshopping proceeded on Uncommon Women and Others. Durang describes how much the play was disliked by many of the men who were present and how Wasserstein was ridiculed. The self-consciousness of being as a woman could be said to be her theme, and at the time she began writing, the subject was not easy. Though Wasserstein was witty, the response was often to describe the play as trivial or hackneyed or dull, and Wasserstein as fat. I don't think this was as much because Wendy was a woman writing about women as that she approached insecurities and, ironically, powerlessness. This made women both more and less than lovers or mothers. This made them vulnerable and in a new way frightening. From the O'Neill, the play then went to an off-Broadway theater later that same year, produced by the Phoenix Group, and eventually the lead was replaced by Meryl Streep, and she also played in the film version. Meryl was also a Yale graduate, or was a Yale graduate. Yale Drama School. The Heidi Chronicles won a Pulitzer in 1988. Wasserstein commented that being dyslexic, she'd had trouble reading all her life, and now she'd won a Pulitzer for writing. Wasserstein had a child at age 48 and shortly thereafter got ill and died at 55 in 2006. Her daughter was adopted by her billionaire brother, Bruce. And we'll move on to Neil Simon. I'm going to take a breath here for a minute. Okay. In 1927, when Neil Simon was born, the nation was suffering from the Depression. Neil's family struggled, and there were emotional repercussions, making life at home difficult. Neil went to the movies a lot. He grew up in Manhattan, was known at school to be extremely shy. Practicality motivated Simon to take writing seriously as a potential means of income. When he was 7 or 8, he wanted to be independent. He turned to comedy to cover up the pain and anxiety at home, according to his own analysis. He saw a lot of Chaplin and Keaton and Laurel and Hardy movies and became obsessed with wanting to make audiences laugh so hard that they would pass out. Simon and his brother wrote comedy sketches for pay as part of a display at a department store. I guess they must have had people acting in the window while he was still in high school. Simon read great comedic writers to hone his craft. He joined the Army Reserves after high school and wrote as a sports editor during that time. He was stationed in Colorado and attended the University of Denver. Back in New York City, he began writing comedy skits for the radio series The Robert G. Lewis Show, leading to work on Your Show of Shows, where he collaborated with about 10 writers, including Carl Reiner and Sid Caesar, and other contributors were Mel Brooks and Woody Allen. Simon's play premiered in 1993, Laughter on the 23rd Floor, recounts these adventures. The play was adapted for TV and won 2 Emmy nominations in 2001. But back to the beginning of his career, Neil Simon's first Broadway play was Come Blow Your Horn in 1961, followed by Barefoot in the Park in 63, and The Odd Couple in 65. His career continued with plays, screenplays, and script doctoring. In the 1980s, Brighton Beach Memoirs, Biloxi Blues, and Broadway Bound very much inspired by his own youth, were successful on Broadway. In 1991, a follow-up play, Lost in Yonkers, won the Pulitzer. Excuse me. Neil Simon's work demonstrates that great playwrights can choose different parameters and move audiences. Simon focuses on character, and the humor he uses emanates from them, from the way they cope with their lives. It took me a while to really appreciate him. It's you know, a different angle, but very effective. And now to John Guare. You will have heard of him because of his play 6 Degrees of Separation, right? Guare's absurd and even surrealistic style has brought us The House of Blue Leaves and 6 Degrees of Separation. He was born in Queens in 1938, but moved upstate with his family for a while as his father recovered from a heart attack. His father was a very strict Catholic, and the school in Ellenville not meeting his criteria, Guare was homeschooled, leaving him time to go to the movies and read and write. He graduated from the Yale School of Drama with an MFA in playwriting in 1962. Guare's early plays, mostly comic one-acts exhibiting a flair for the absurd, include To Wally Pantone, We Leave a Credenza, produced at Cafe Chino. And then other plays went to Broadway, Cop Out, Home Fires, I guess fairly successful. The House of Blue Leaves premiered off-Broadway in 1971 at the Truck and Warehouse Theater. Numerous off-Broadway revivals led to this quote from Marilyn Stasi, writing in Variety, that the play sets the bar for smart comic lunacy. Later plays included Marco Polo Sings a Solo, produced at the Public Theater, with Joel Grey, Ann Jackson, Madeline Kahn, and Sigourney Weaver, and Bosoms and Neglect on Broadway in '79. Guare also wrote a cycle of plays describing 19th century America, Gardenia in '82, Lydia Breeze, also '82, and Women and Water in '85. The Lydia Breeze series follows a group of idealistic 19th century characters and their attempts to create a utopian society. 6 Degrees of Separation was originally produced off-Broadway at the Lincoln Center Theater, starring Stockard Channing, and then it went on to Broadway, also with Stockard Channing, and she and Will Smith starred in the 1993 movie version. Guare has also revised books for Kiss Me Kate, and he wrote the book for the musical The Sweet Smell of Success, and he won a Pulitzer for A Free Man of Color. Oh no, he was a finalist for that. It was described as an audacious play spread across a large historical canvas dealing with serious subjects while retaining a playful intellectual buoyancy. And Guare wrote the screenplay for Louis Malle's film Atlantic City with Burt Lancaster and Susan Sarandon, he was nominated for an Oscar for that. He was an original member of the O'Neill Foundation, O'Neill Center in Waterford. And he lives in New York City. And David Rabe. His mother was a department store worker and his father a teacher and meat packer. They lived in Dubuque, Iowa. He was drafted in '65 and then went back to school in Villanova, where he began writing. 3 of his most well-known plays concerned Vietnam: Sticks and Bones, The Basic Training of Pablo Hamel, and Streamers. Sticks and Bones was produced and won a Tony in 1972. The Basic Training of Pablo Hamel was produced off-Broadway and won an Albee in '73. And Streamers premiered at the Long Wharf in Connecticut in '76 and then went to off-Broadway to Lincoln Center. Also in '76. And one of his plays that is, I think, pretty unique is Hurly-Burly, which was first staged at the Goodman in Chicago and then opened off-Broadway at the Promenade in Manhattan in '84. And the Broadway production, directed by Mike Nichols, opened in '84 at the Ethel Barrymore with Bill Hurt, Chris Walken, Harvey Keitel, Jerry Stiller, Judith Ivey, Sigourney Weaver, and Cynthia Nixon. Hurly Burly is an exceptionally verbally rich play, unusually demanding and exhilarating for cast and audience both. Successful films are made of streamers and of Hurly Burly. David Rabe lives on the Upper West Side of New York. He was married to Jill Clayburgh and now has two children, Michael and Lily. Lily's an acclaimed actress. And John Patrick Shanley. Born in the Bronx, grew up in a very rough neighborhood. His father was a meat packer, his mother was a telephone operator. John did poorly at school and was frequently kicked out a couple times, or he was frequently kicked out. He went to NYU, but struggled with school, and then joined the Marines, serving stateside during the Vietnam War. He went back to NYU on the GI Bill, worked odd jobs, and finally graduated as valedictorian in '77. He took a playwriting class at NYU and found that dialogue writing flowed easily. His first play, Danny and the Deep Blue Sea, was produced off-Broadway and was successful after being developed at the Actors Theater of Louisville, one of the places new plays are nurtured. That's in Kentucky and is one of the famous regional sites for new material. June Stein and John Tarturo starred in the two-person drama about two troubled souls who challenge and transform each other. John decided to write a movie, hoping to stop having to work odd jobs to get by. Moonstruck, starring Cher and Nicolas Cage, won an Oscar for Best Screenplay. And I think was a turning point for him. John continued writing plays with Joe Papp at the Public and at Manhattan Theater Club and more. And he wrote more movies. In 2005, his play Doubt, a Parable, went to Broadway after a run off-Broadway at the Manhattan Theater Club, and won a Pulitzer and a Tony. The movie version, starring Philip Seymour Hoffman and Meryl Streep, which Shanley directed, was made in 2008 and received several Academy Award nominations. John lives in New York City. Israel Horowitz, born in Wakefield, Mass., to Hazel and Julius, a lawyer. And at age 13, he wrote his first novel, which was rejected by Simon & Schuster, but complimented for its wonderful childlike qualities. Okay, how much time do I have left? Anybody have the time?
It's 20 to 8.
It's 20 to 8?
It is.
Oh, my God. Well, let me just quickly. Well, Horowitz wrote, he wrote Indian Wants the Bronx, which starred John Cazale and Al Pacino, and ran for years and years in the city. And then he also is well known for living in France and having his plays done there a lot. Let me go on to John Ford Noonan, who wrote A Couple of White Chicks Sitting Around Talking. That's his most famous play. And he was an extraordinary personality and very charismatic and wrote a lot of plays, nominated for a Pulitzer, but never got one. And then we'll go to Sam Shepard, because that's how I'm winding up. Shepard was born in Illinois in '43, also did music, got involved with Patti Smith, and generally was a productive member of the off-Broadway community. And they premiered Cowboy Mouth, which I think won an Albee. And he's important in this context because he's another shift. He marks the shift toward a more free associative type of writing in which the individual really takes over as the focus as opposed to the plot. Although he has families and there are things that happen that are dramatic, it's really, there's a level of surreality and freedom in his writing that is a shift. He described himself as having been influenced by O'Neill, and I think of him as sort of the heir because he focuses on family knots. He didn't do Broadway. He didn't want to. He was certainly offered the opportunity to do so, but he preferred off-Broadway. And he worked with Ellen Stewart. He worked with, and famously at Circle Rep in New York, where he directed Fool for Love himself. True West went from the Magic in 1980, that's the San Francisco theater he was affiliated with, to the Public in New York, and then to Steppenwolf in Chicago, and then it went to the Cherry Lane in New York, starring John Malkovich and Gary Sinise, and putting them on the map. And then A Lie of the Mind was rehearsed and produced at the Promenade in New York with Harvey Keitel, Geraldine Page, Aidan Quinn. Very complex play, very good play. So I will close with him so that we have a chance to hear some questions. I had this sentence to sort of wind things up, that theater is still important. When we go to the theater and share, whether we talk about the responses we have or not, there's a certain understanding that I think is a matter of physics that happens as people respond together to the action on the stage. So, take some questions.
Thank you, Kathy.
Certainly.
Do we have any questions in our studio audience? No? Okay. I'm going to repeat the telephone number. If anybody out there in listening land has a question they'd like to direct to Kathy, that number is 715-942-9917. I brought up a couple questions that came to my mind, so we can start maybe with one of those. For you personally, Kathy, which playwright or playwrights most influence your personal writing style?
Probably O'Neill and Shepard, though they're both so different because of that. I would say I'm most interested in interpersonal dynamics. So each of them seem familiar to me in that sense. It's something that I'm already always thinking about and exploring. My first plays were, what my friend Trish Hawkins said, it was like Czechberg, because it was sort of Chekhovish. I thought she was intended this as a great compliment, but it also had these dark family struggles going on that I did use some elements that were intensified versions of reality, not strictly naturalistic. So since then I've become more naturalistic, but I still like to employ sudden shifts in tempo and focus to provoke an audience and to reveal things about the psyches of the people involved. So I would say those two.
Okay, and here's one from our television audience. What is Kathy's favorite U.S. play, and how do you think COVID-19 is affecting theater?
Oh my gosh. Well, I'll start backwards. I mean, it's horrifying. Ian and I had been scheduled to go see a play on Broadway about a year ago, April 2020. And of course we couldn't go. And it was rescheduled for April 2021, and now that's been canceled. It's just terrible. People are doing some plays via Zoom, as Barb is doing with the radio show coming up. And some of them have been successful. I've read a little about them. I haven't seen any. And but it's a huge economic blow to the city of New York, to the theater owners, to the tech hands, to the actors. It's a good time to write. What was the first?
The first
part?
question was your favorite U.S. play.
That's tough. I cannot. I'm going to take the fifth. I can't choose a play. I really can't. They all each have some special. Of course, things that I've seen or been in as an actor have special meaning to me because you get immersed, and I was in Iceman Cometh once as one of the working girls, and we performed in a bar in Boston, and so I got very, very familiar with the play and all of its many implications. And then we also went to Walpole State Prison and performed there, which was a huge experience because, and for many reasons, but partly because we worked with a bunch of prisoners. I'm getting far afield. Anyway, so that's one of my favorites. Gosh, I don't know. Lie of the Mind, because I was there watching it being rehearsed, helping Geraldine with her lines, name drop. But that was exciting. It was very exciting. So that has a special meaning to me. Geez, I don't know. I like plays.
Okay. Similar question about COVID. My question, in this time of COVID, can we still get the audience group energy?
I'll say I think that is the question, and I think that what we can do is appreciate how important it is and remember to support theater when it comes back. I do not think it's the same watching a movie, even in the theater, although that's very special too. But it's not the same as live theater in terms of the chemistry and the physics of it. There's a certain transference of thought that goes on and emotion, and I think everyone who goes to live theater has experienced it. And I just hope that I don't think it can be replaced. I don't know. I mean, not so far. So far, we're all just waiting.
I have another question. Do you think that some of the kind of over-the-top major musical productions overshadow a more straightforward drama or stage comedy?
Oh, no question about it. Musicals are the bank. That's what's done on Broadway, much more so than straight plays as they're known. And that's been true for a long, long time. And musicals vary. Some of them are, brilliant and very moving, but it's a different genre. And but I think that the economics are such that if we didn't have musicals, and if some of them weren't over the top and silly, we wouldn't. The economics are very, very challenging to do plays on Broadway because the costs are so high. Off-Broadway is better, and off-Broadway and regional theater continue to pull their weight. I mean, that's something, I remember with the advent of the VCR and tapes, people thought, well, nobody's ever going to go to the movies again. And you have all sorts of things like that have happened to theater. But, and people don't go as much. But plays are still big business and work, and it's a great goal, and actors want to be in them. And a lot of times nowadays, people, producers will look for a ringer. I mean, I guess they have for quite a while, a name, someone who's made it in the film business. And so audiences will be familiar with them and will come and pay big bucks to see the play. But a lot of times the actors are very good, and they're not just there for their name. So it's a win-win. But musicals vary. There was a time when I felt sort of resentful of them because I knew that producers were saying, well, will the Japanese tourists come? They weren't just concerned about Bridge and Tunnel or American tourists. We had to please, people so they had to have roller skates or they had to have whatever. And so that gets a little silly, but I think that's calmed down a bit. Road shows are another important thing, and musicals on the road usually strip down a little bit from the Broadway cast, but that helps keep theater alive when you've got road shows, straight and musical, because they can go all over the country, and the people aren't usually huge stars, so they're not paying them a huge amount of money, and it works well, and it gets us a chance to see theater.
Kind of a comment and a question. I appreciated your inclusion, where possible, of some women and people of color. Do you foresee an expansion and greater diversity in roles, directing and playwriting for women?
I think
and
so. Yeah, yes, Ann. I think that
different things.
for several reasons. One, because this, the audiences want to feel that they're participating in the integration of America, but also because as more people of color and more women have more confidence and get more support at home and in their communities to be artists, I think that the ratio will pick up for that reason as well. Speaking as a woman, I would say I've seen change happen in terms of writers and producers and directors. I think there's just a gradual continuum of less intimidation or less willingness to be intimidated. So more women make more progress and can express themselves and find success. I think it's inevitably going to keep increasing, yes.
Last chance, audience?
I should have written them down when I was watching, but
Well, thank you, Kathy. This was great.
Thank you, Ann. Thank you guys very much.